If you allow me to introduce myself shortly, my name is Johannes Zachuga. I teach here in Oxford at the Theology faculty, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the second night of our Humanitas guest lectures in the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. Of course, it's my very great pleasure, in particular, to welcome once again Jonathan Sachs. Lord Sachs has started giving his course of lectures yesterday, and those of you who were, like myself, fortunate enough to hear him speak yesterday have witnessed how he's taken us on the beginning of an intellectual journey, and I think we all very much look forward to hear the continuation of this. Before I therefore, without much further ado, pass on to our speaker, let me just announce one thing, and that is that on the final day of these lectures, that is on Thursday, there will be, prior to the lecture, from 4 to 4:30, a reception here, I understand, where there will be an opportunity to talk to Lord Sachs. So that's Thursday at 4 p.m. And with this, I'm happy to hand over, Lord Sachs. We look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you. Johannes, thank you so much. And today I'm just the tiniest bit more relaxed than yesterday. So can I begin by telling you a story? I mean, if you wouldn't mind. I mean, it's an enormous privilege to be here at Oxford, and I studied here in the early 70s at New College, but I was an undergraduate at Cambridge. And it was there in Cambridge, when I was sort of chairing the Jewish Society, that I had the privilege of inviting over to Cambridge to address us a great Oxford scholar, the late Professor David Dauber. I don't know if any of you knew of him or knew him. Professor Dauber was an extraordinary Renaissance man who, on his 60th birthday, received Festschriften in 3 different subjects, Roman law, of which he was Regius Professor here, Old Testament studies and New Testament studies. And he had a wonderful and mischievous sense of humor. And he asked me what I was studying. And I said I was studying philosophy. And he immediately said, "Oh, terrible, terrible thing, philosophy. Give it up immediately. Philosophers are so ethereal and they never know what day of the week it is. And no, you must give it up." And I will illustrate this with a story. He said, "Who is your favorite philosopher?" Wittgenstein, I suppose. Now you understand, if you were studying philosophy in Cambridge in the late 60s, as I was, your hero had to be Wittgenstein. And so he told me the following story. He said Wittgenstein was standing at the Oxford station, waiting for the London train, and was immersed in metaphysical conversation with 2 of his colleagues, Professor H.L.A. Hart and Elizabeth Anscombe. So immersed were they in their philosophical speculations that they entirely failed to notice the train as it drew into the station. They were still talking as people were getting on and off, and finally they looked up just as the train was about to leave. I don't know if you remember, those of you who will remember Professor Hart will remember he had a rather strong Germanic accent, and he said, "And Professor Hart ran and heaved himself on board, and Elizabeth Anscombe, an enormous woman, ran and heaved herself on board, and Wittgenstein ran but could not catch up with the train and was left standing at the station watching it as it left for London. So disconsolate did he appear that a woman felt moved to come up to him and say, 'Don't worry, there will be another train in an hour's time. And he turned to her and said, "But you don't understand. They came to see me off." So always pause and think where you are going. Now, I think I didn't pause yesterday, and I was going at a great rate of knots, and therefore probably rather too fast. So today I'm going to slow the pace a little bit, and I just want us to pause today to think about an extremely fundamental issue, which, if we become clear about it, and I hope you will have a little of the sense of revelation and discovery that I had, then we will think about the interfaith encounter in a different way. Yesterday, I argued that there is inner biblical evidence that God loves diversity. He loves biodiversity, which he creates at the beginning of time, and he loves human diversity. And that, I argued, was the meaning of the story of the Tower of Babel, if we read it not as an enclosed narrative, but in the wider context of Genesis 10 and the total context of Genesis 1 to 12. However, had I been sitting where you were sitting yesterday, I would have raised a fundamental objection to what I have been saying. And this on simple logical grounds. Let us limit ourselves for the time being, well, let us limit ourselves for the duration of this lecture, or even this lecture series, to the Abrahamic monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, two things are pretty obvious. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam disagree on fundamental issues. If they didn't, there wouldn't be a Judaism, a Christianity, and an Islam. So they disagree. It follows, therefore, that at most only one of them can be correct. And therefore, how can I possibly argue, as I did yesterday, that God loves religious diversity if truth is not diverse, if truth is singular? I alluded yesterday to the oldest of all Jewish jokes, the rabbi who is mediating a family dispute, and he sits with one of his disciples present, and he hears the husband's story for an hour, all about his complaints about his wife, and he concludes, "You are right." The next day, he spends an hour listening to the wife's complaint about the husband, and he, at the end, turns to the wife and says, "You are right." And when the wife has left, the disciple turns to the rabbi and says, "How can the husband be right and the wife be right?" And the rabbi looks at the student and says, "You're also right." Now, that is a joke. Reality ain't like that, and therefore, how can I confront the obvious objection that God may love diversity, but surely God also loves truth? God is not a relativist, at least not the way you and I read the Bible. I mean, he's not, that's the trouble. God didn't go to Oxford, mind you. I'm not suggesting he went to Cambridge either. But one way or another, how can we, as it were, rise beyond the challenge that this relativizes religious truth? That is the obvious objection any believer, a Jew, would say. How can I say that there is validity in Christianity and Islam? And the same if I were a Christian or if I were a Muslim. However, that is the lesser of two objections, because a similar objection could be made much more sharply. I remember I never met the man. There was a professor Sir Hermann Bondi. I didn't know him. I don't know if any of you did. He was an Austrian Jewish mathematician who came to Britain just before the war, had a chair at King's College London, later Master of Churchill College, Cambridge, and President of the British Humanist Society. And I mentioned the name because I remember years ago, decades ago, he wrote a letter to the Times, which I recall went something like this. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all make different and incompatible claims. Therefore, only one of the three can be true, but we don't know which one. And therefore, logically, if two of the three are definitely false, it would be logical to conclude of each of them that it is false. This was his QED, that religion is self-refuting. So, are you with me? So, at most, one of the three can be true, and maybe goes the skeptical suggestion that in terms of probability, if two of the three are false, then for any one of the three, the probability is that it is false. Now, that is a pretty impressive challenge. And obviously, I regard neither of these challenges as valid, but I want in this lecture to say why. Obviously, the immediate superficial answer is to say, who says that your concept of truth, which may be very workable for science and may be workable for mathematics, is the same concept of truth that we can apply to matters of the spirit? And that would be a nice, easy, simple way. But I want us to investigate a little more deeply. So, let me begin here with another little story. 16 years ago, I was privileged with others to receive something called the Jerusalem Prize, which is given in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day. And after the prize is given, the President of the State of Israel invites the prize winners to a reception at the President's house. The President of Israel at the time was a rather assertive secularist. And he, in his little words of congratulation to me, which he luckily spoke in Hebrew so that my friends who were there didn't understand what he was saying, said something like this: I see Rabbi Sachs has been given his award for his contributions to religious education. Now, religious education, he said in Hebrew, is better than nothing, but, and proceeded to say how what we really needed is lots of secular Jewish schools which teach people to speak Hebrew and forget about all the religion nonsense. Now, I came back and had one of my regular breakfasts with the ambassador, Israeli ambassador, and I said to him, Mr. Ambassador, now I understand how it is that after 4,000 years, the Hebrew language does still not contain a word that means tact. Am I right, Professor Strumze? If you speak to an Israeli and you say, now what's the Hebrew for tact? They say tact, be'ivrit ze tact. That's it. They have to use the English word because there is no Hebrew word. So, from this, I think we can see that not every language slices up reality in the same way. It's a long time since I studied Aristotle. But at the very heart of Aristotle's ethics is a virtue or a type of human being that he called the megalopsuchos. I don't know how you translate that into English, but I always felt that the megalopsuchos was somebody like, do you remember there was a writer of short stories in the Edwardian era, H.H. Munro, who wrote short stories under the name of Sagi, and there are two Edwardian gentlemen in one of his stories who have half an hour to spare, in which they're not quite sure what to do, and one says to the other, let's stroll around looking effortlessly superior. And I think that's what the megalopsuchos did, very gracefully, but effortlessly superior. How do you translate that concept as a virtue into a Judeo-Christian ethic? Or the other way around? How do you translate a central virtue in the Judeo-Christian ethic, namely humility? How do you translate that into the ethical world of Aristotle? Those things just don't go. They are not translatable into one another. The rabbis themselves in the 3rd or 4th century seem to have been aware of this. I have no idea, I'm sure it isn't quite as simple as this, but the Talmud in the Tractate of Megillah refers to a famous document, the first translation of the Hebrew Bible into another language, the translation done in the days of Ptolemy II that we call the Shivim, the Septuagint, because of the 70 or 72 scholars who put it together. And according to the Talmud, the rabbis deliberately mistranslated certain verses because they felt that were they to translate them literally, they would be unintelligible to a Greek readership. And one of the examples it gives is that, it must be the opening line of Genesis 2, God finished on the 7th day the work that he had made, and they translated that into Greek to read, and God finished on the 6th day. What was it that the Talmud is assuming the translators thought the Greeks would not understand? And the answer is very simple, that it is not difficult to understand divine creativity in terms of a 6-day period in which God brings the universe into being. That is creative. But how is the 7th day, when God does nothing, how can that be part of the process of creation? How can rest, cessation of work, be creative? And the rabbis felt that a Greek could not understand that idea. And indeed, if you read the Hellenistic writers on Judaism, both in Greek and Latin, none of them understands the Sabbath. They thought Jews rested on the 7th day because they were lazy, not because there was something creative about ceasing from work and whatever it is that we do on the Sabbath. So there are words that are not translatable from one language to another. And that is extremely important for us to understand. I want us to stay with this idea and see how deeply it goes. If you read the Hebrew Bible or you read Jewish history, there is a fair amount of suffering in it. One wit once suggested that you could give a simple 3-sentence definition of every Jewish festival, which goes as follows. They tried to destroy us, we survived, let's eat. Are you with me? So there's a lot of suffering going on. You've got slavery in Egypt, you have the destruction of the temple, you have the Book of Lamentations, you have Psalm 137, by the waters of Babylon we sat and wept as we remembered Zion. You even have a verse key to both Judaism and Christianity, Psalm 22, Eli, Keli, lama azavtani, my God, why have you forsaken me? There are human disasters, suffering, and a sense of forsakenness. And therefore, I ask a very simple question: what is the Hebrew word for tragedy. And there is none. And that is odd, because that's a word that you might have thought the biblical writers had a certain amount of use for. But there is no Hebrew word for tragedy. There are words for bad things happening, ason, for instance, misfortune, catastrophe. But tragedy, no. And so when Hebrew was revived as a spoken language in the 19th century, it simply had to borrow the Greek word, or the Latin word. The Hebrew for tragedy is tragedia. It had to be lifted from the Greek. Why is it that biblical Judaism has no word for tragedy? Tragedy is a central concept in the Greece of Athens. Sophocles and Aeschylus are the world's great masters in tragedy. It is absolutely fundamental to a Greek worldview, but Hebrew does not have a word for it. Jorge Luis Borges wrote a short story called Averroes' Search, in which Averroes is translating Aristotle's rhetoric, and he comes across these two words, tragedy and comedy, and tries as he might, and he searches the world and the world's literature, and he can't work out what these words mean. So here is a central concept in Greek culture which does not exist in biblical Hebrew. Let me give you an even more surprising example, which I was completely unaware of until some of my books had to be translated into Hebrew. And my goodness me, we hit problems that I never thought about. How would we describe the God of Abraham? Judah Halevi, the 11th century Jewish philosopher or anti-philosopher, talks about the God of Abraham and the God of Aristotle. Martin Buber talks about I, thou, as against I, it. The God of Aristotle, of Spinoza, even of Einstein, is an impersonal God, whereas a first cause, a prime mover, etc., etc. But the God of Abraham, the God who listens to prayer, the God who speaks, is what we would call a personal God. That's what every theologian calls him. Now, I had no idea that simple basic phrase, a personal God, is actually untranslatable into Hebrew. Am I right? Because Hebrew has no word for person. That really is extraordinary. If you think about it, here we are created in the image of God. God speaks to us as persons and in terms of personal relationship. B'ni b'chori Israel, God says to Moses to say to Pharaoh, my child, my firstborn Israel. These are interpersonal relationships. Verastich li le'olam, God says to Israel through the prophet Hosea, I will betroth you to me forever. These are personal relationships, and yet there is no word for person in biblical Hebrew. Why is that? Anyone know? Can anyone think?
Community.
What?
Community.
No. The words for individual, human being, enosh, adam, ben adam. What? Yeah?
I'm saying things in Jewish tradition.
Yeah.
Not the person.
Yeah, but we still have persons. Are you with me? Yes, there is Moses alone with God. There is Abraham alone with God. Yes, community, and, we could talk about that. But, there are these singular encounters. Moses at the burning bush, God speaking to Abraham, get thee out from, etc. So we have to go back and ask, what is the word person? What is the etymology of that word? And of course the etymology of the word is from the Latin persona, which refers to the mask worn by an actor in a play. It is, and hence, the role that is played when we see life as the audience in a theatre watching a play and watching the actors wearing masks. Now, in Judaism, there can be no metaphor which involves theatre, because that doesn't exist in Judaism. The very idea that we're defined by our mask and the role we play on a stage is cut through directly. When you remember God says to Samuel, when Samuel thinks he's found one of Jesse's sons who looks the part of a king, and God says, God does not see as human beings see. Human beings look at appearances, whereas God sees the heart. So the idea that we play roles on a stage and we wear masks doesn't make any sense at all in a culture in which God knows us from the inside. And hence masks and playing roles are completely outside. They belong to a different universe. They belong to a different universe. What's his name? Lionel Trilling has a very interesting passage on this in his book, Sincerity and Authenticity, on why the rabbis had no idea of the heroic, because the hero is somebody who lives life as if an actor upon a stage. And in Judaism, you don't live life as an actor on a stage. You live life in proximity to God, who knows you better than you know yourself. And let us take this a little further still. And I am taking you along a journey for a reason. There is a metaphor that dominates our concepts of knowledge. What metaphor do we use whenever we use phrases or sayings for, knowledge or truth? They are all, if you think about it, visual metaphors. We talk about foresight, insight, hindsight. Somebody makes an observation. There's a person with vision. The very word idea comes from the same Greek root as the word video. Truth is something that is seen. In fact, if you finally work out what your lecturer is trying to say to you, you will say, I see. So systemically through English and through Greek, where this metaphor comes from, our concept of knowledge is based on the metaphor of sight. Now, if you look in the Bible and the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Zohar, the classic of Jewish mysticism, use a different metaphor. But if you look at the Babylonian Talmud, for instance, and certainly if you think about the Bible, you will see that the metaphor is completely different. What is the Hebrew for to understand? Shema. Lavin, yes, but Shema. Hear, to listen. When the Talmud wants to say, infer this from that, it says, Shema mina, hear from this. When it wants to bring a proof, it says, ta shema, come and hear. If somebody doesn't agree with your logic, lo shmiale, he couldn't hear it. When we say that X implies Y, komashmalon, this lets us hear the following. And when we talk about the received wisdom, we call it mipi hashmu'ah, that which has been heard. So we have here a completely and systemically different metaphor a metaphor of hearing. And you will understand that this is what made Greece of antiquity and Israel of antiquity what Isaiah Berlin used to call incommensurable. They belong to different non-intersecting universes. Athens was a supremely visual culture whose high achievements lay in art and architecture and theatre and spectacle. And it was through and through a visual culture. Judaism actually, on principle, rejects a visual culture because it believes in a God who cannot be seen, a God who therefore can only be known by being heard. And hence all those emphatic statements in the Bible where Moses says at Sinai, Loritem kol tumunah, when the Israelites encountered God at Mount Sinai, you saw no form, just a voice. And why the supreme declaration of faith in Judaism is Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. And so, and indeed the word hear, the root Shema in Hebrew, is as rich in its resonances as the metaphor of sight is in its resonances. Shema in biblical Hebrew means to listen, to hear, to strive to understand, to internalize, and to respond in action. I once pointed out that it is extraordinary, in Judaism we've got a lot of commands in the Mosaic books, 613 of them according to tradition. You would have thought that a culture that contains 613 divine commandments must contain what verb? To obey. You would have thought you can't have a culture with that many commands that doesn't have a word meaning to obey. But biblical Hebrew has no verb that means to obey. And therefore, when, again, Hebrew was being revived in the 19th century and you needed a word to obey, an Aramaic word was adopted, l'tzayet, which is not a Hebrew verb, but an Aramaic one. What is the word that means obey in Hebrew? Shema. But Shema doesn't just mean to obey, it means to hear, to understand, and so on. So you will see the concept of blind obedience, what Kant called heteronomy, cannot exist in Judaism. I mean, he takes Judaism as the paradigm case of a heteronomous culture. And that just shows that Kant really did not understand the untranslatability or the incommensurability of Hebrew, because there can be no concept of blind obedience in Judaism because there's no verb that means just to obey. Okay, so we have, I hope, now begun to understand that the key concepts of major civilizations may not be translatable into one another. And that Greece and Israel of antiquity, the world of Athens and the world of Jerusalem, were two profoundly different cultures that were untranslatable into one another. And now comes, and here I'm speaking way, way outside my expertise, so please correct me immediately if I'm wrong. But here comes what physicists call, or cosmologists call, a singularity. An extraordinary, unrepeatable event. And that extraordinary, unrepeatable event is the birth of Christianity, which brings together the world of Greece and the world of Israel. We know what language, according to the New Testament, Jesus spoke. Whenever we have his ipsissima verba, he is speaking Aramaic. When he speaks about God, he uses the Aramaic word Abba. When he tells a young girl to get up, he says, Talita kum. When he is on the way to the crucifixion and he is quoting Psalm 22, Eli, Eli, lama zavachthani, he is quoting the Aramaic translation of Psalm 22, the Targum. Jesus speaks Aramaic, the language spoken by Jews in the land of Israel in the first century, and would have read and understood the Bible in Hebrew and in its Aramaic translation. Hence the unique irony of the fact that all the early Christian texts were written in Greek. Not only were all the early Christian texts written in Greek, the Bible that the early Christians read was in Greek. It was the Septuagint. Not until Jerome did people start really, going back to look at the Hebrew. Now, there is, as I have been able to discover, and I may be quite wrong, there is no established scholarly consensus as to whether or not Jesus spoke Greek. I don't mean a few words from everyday conversation of the kind that you might need in a multi-ethnic Israel, but whether he actually spoke Greek in the sense of being able to understand the sacred scriptures of the religion that he founded. So here we have two fundamentally, radically, profoundly different cultures, Athens and Jerusalem, and you have Christianity which mediates between them and creates a new synthesis of them. But the founder of Christianity belongs to one, and the sacred scriptures of Christianity belong to the other. So we have now a problem that has not fully been recognized for the serious problem that it is, because of our illusion that languages are translatable into one another. Now, I'm pretty sure you could do a reasonable translation into most languages of the world for a sentence like "pass the marmalade," or whatever else you get Google Translate to translate. But whether you could translate from one language to another concepts as profound as truth, faith, or knowledge, whether those are translatable from one culture to another, seems to me to be an entirely open question. And now I have to ask you to do two little thought experiments here. Let us think about thinking itself. Let us think about the pursuit of knowledge. Will this work as a metaphor? Will this work as a metaphor? I don't imagine you do, but a lot of people out there spend a fair number of hours each day watching a television screen. That's one way you come to know about the world. And how does that happen? You're in one domain, one bit of reality, and you are looking at another bit of reality in a different dimension, as it were. You are not actually in the unless you're watching yourself on television, but you're not actually in the world that you're watching. So you can imagine the process of knowledge as a detached spectator watching stuff on a television screen. That is roughly what the Greeks believed Zeus was doing from the top of Mount Olympus. He was watching the world's greatest soap opera called Humanity. I mean, this is in the days before Simon Cowell was invented. And I think that's one possible metaphor for knowledge. You are looking out at a world, and you want to make sure that what you are seeing is actually there. What you are seeing on your screen is actually there. And of course, this is the metaphor, more or less. Plato didn't have television, but that's roughly the image he uses in that famous section of the Republic, his metaphor of the cave. People are sitting in the cave, they're chained, they're prisoners, they've never been out in daylight, they're watching the play of shadows on the wall, and suddenly one of them is set free, and he is able to go outside the cave, and he then realizes that what he's seeing on the wall, our sense perceptions, let us say, are not actually real, the reality is out there in the sunlight, so that we have to develop a special kind of sight to see the objective reality behind mere appearances. And that is obviously a visual metaphor. You are observing, and the fact of the things observed. What you have in here is all subjective. What's out there is all objective. And the search for knowledge is to make sure that your subjective impression corresponds to objective reality out there. Does that make a reasonable way of describing one way? We are spectators of a world in which we do not directly participate, and we try to make sure that our subjective impression of the world corresponds to its objective reality. And that is the metaphor of knowledge as sight. Once I can check that the world really is as it seems to be on my television screen, then I have genuine knowledge. That is one way of thinking about knowledge. But I want you to think now about a different way of knowledge and see whether this makes sense to you. Have you ever had the following situation? You've got a boss or a teacher or your local vicar or your local rabbi, and you've known them for years, they've known you for years, you've seen them in action, you think you know them. You think you know them. And then something happens, you bump into one another unexpectedly, let's say on holiday, or they're visiting you and you're in crisis, you're visiting them, they're in crisis, whatever it is, you sit together, you have a coffee, you have a whiskey, you talk into the small hours of the night, you talk and talk and talk, and you suddenly realize, I never really knew that person before. Now I really think I know. I always thought his aloofness was because he was a snob. Now I understand it's because he was shy. Or I always thought his jokiness was because he was just not that serious. But now I realize that's an act he puts on, and really he feels things very intensely. Have you had an experience like that? If you do, then you might well come away from that deep encounter and say, I never really knew that person before. Now I think I do. Now, that's another kind of way of thinking about knowing. Does that make sense to you? And that has much more to do with listening than with appearances. And I think we can begin to understand that there might be two different kinds of knowledge. One based on detached, one based on observation, another based on empathy. One based on distance and detachment, one based on intimacy. One based on a kind of impersonal stance, but the other utterly personal. And one form of knowledge is gained by observing, and the other is by engaging, by communicating, by speaking and listening. And that, if you can keep those two very separate concepts of knowledge apart, then we can begin to see why Greek culture favored that one, observing, and the culture of ancient Israel favored the other one, the knowledge that comes from speaking and listening. And they are different kinds of knowledge. And that is why, for instance, this is the famous knowing in the biblical sense. And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and she gave birth to a child, right? What they call, is that what, what's his name? Tom Stoppard calls at the beginning of Arcadia, carnal knowledge. But you understand it. It says, V'adam yada et chava ishto, Adam knew. So clearly the word dat, the Hebrew for knowledge, the Hebrew that we translate as knowledge, doesn't actually mean knowledge in that Platonic sense. It means intimacy. When we read at the end of Exodus chapter 2, when the Israelites are enslaved. And it says, God saw the Israelites, Vayeda Elokim, and God knew. And what the word there means is not that he knew something he didn't know before. God knew this all along. Rashi is right to translate the word know there as meaning God was moved to compassion. So the Hebrew word that we translate lightly as knowledge is something altogether different from what the Greeks would have understood as knowledge, namely the kind of thing they pursued in those two eminent disciplines, the disciplines in which Greece bequeathed the whole of humanity, namely science and philosophy. Those are Greek accomplishments, and they are to this day. And clearly the kind of knowledge talked about in the Hebrew Bible is not that kind of knowledge at all. And it follows, therefore, and to put this in slightly technical, philosophical terms, Donald Davidson has written a book, the logician has written a book with this title. The Greeks are interested in the subjective and the objective. But the Hebrews were interested in what philosophers call the intersubjective, what Martin Buber called, my German is non-existent, the Zwischenmenschlichkeit. Is that about right? Something or other, which I think you would translate as, the between, the intersubjectivity. In other words, what the Greeks were interested in knowing was truth and facts. What the Jews were interested in was relationships. And those are two very different spheres. Now, what does a scientist want to discover? A scientist wants to discover universal laws which allow us to identify regularities and hence arrive at predictability. That is essential to the scientific enterprise. We know roughly how it began. It began, as far as we can tell, in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, low-lying flatland subject to periodic flooding. And all ancient cultures from that part of the world had a flood narrative, the Enuma Elish, whatever it is, there are lots of them, and so on and so forth. Now, I think it would help if you are an investment manager today to know exactly when the next stock exchange crash is about to happen. So, by more or less in parallel, it helped if you were a farmer in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley to know when the next flood was going to happen. Somebody, some unknown genius, discovered that the sun rises at a different point of the horizon each day, and there is a correlation between the sun being at a particular point in the horizon and the danger of inundation. And with that, in Mesopotamia, the calendar was born. And we still have all the marks of that Mesopotamian hexadecimal system based on sixes. We still define the heavens and the circle in terms of 360 degrees. We still define the day in terms of 6 hours of each quadrant, the 6 hours before midday, after midday, and the et cetera, et cetera. And all of this is done by observing. There is no way that the ancient Mesopotamian astronomer who first thought about the calendar could have affected the movement of the planets or the occurrence of floods. It's not a matter of affecting. You're not a shaper of what happens, but you can predict it because you have identified regularities. However, when it comes to the human domain, it is altogether different. Humans, even with the best will in the world, are not terribly predictable. And at least not as much as the movement of the sun and the stars. Now, the unpredictability of humans is quite a difficult problem for humanity to solve. I mean, huge amounts of work being done on this. I don't know if you've read Martin Novak's new book, Super Cooperators. It's an enormous fascination to evolutionary biologists. How did humans ever learn to cooperate? We are, on the one hand, independent. We are in the image of God, but we are interdependent. It is not good for man to be alone. So how do we create relationships of mutuality that are sufficiently predictable to be able to create order out of the potential chaos that is the human condition that we are seeing in parts of the world today that Hobbes called a state of nature, the war of all against all? How can you get people to be reliable? I have a friend in Jerusalem who calls his plumber the Messiah. This is a Jewish way of seeing things. We expect him daily, but he never comes. So, what can you do to create reliability and predictability within human affairs? And there are obviously two ways. You can either force people to act the way you want them to, or you can bribe people to act the way you want them to, the way of the state, the way of the market, power, wealth, and so on. But supposing you don't want to resort to those two things, because the use of force or the use of bribery it treats people as means instead of ends, it doesn't respect them as having equal dignity with you, what do you do if your best friend wants to borrow a book that you actually want to see back again? What do you do? Are you with me? How do you create a relationship of trust? And two philosophers, not that many, only two as far as I can see, understood what you need. One of the philosophers was Nietzsche, in a book of his called The Genealogy of Morals. The other was Hannah Arendt, in a book she wrote called The Human Condition. Those two philosophers were unusual in seeing that human cooperation and our victory over the unpredictability of the human situation depends on a single institution, which is making promises. It is making promises, giving your word and honoring your word, that allow free human beings to construct relationships of trust that allow us to create order out of the chaos of humanity. So just stay with that idea of a promise. It was the Oxford philosopher, the next Wittgenstein, called J.L. Austin, who very famously pointed out that when we make a promise, we are using language in a highly specialized way. He called that a performative utterance. When you make a promise, you're not using language to describe something, you are using language to create something. And what are you creating? An obligation. And that, are you with me? When the judge says, or whoever says it, the court is now in session, he's not describing something, he's actually doing it. When a Jewish bridegroom says to his bride under the wedding canopy, behold, you are betrothed to me according to the laws of Moses and Israel, he's not describing something, he's doing it. He's not describing a marriage, he is entering into a marriage. And that is what happens when we make promises. We use language to create. And that is how free moral agents cooperate and are able to rely on one another because they're capable of entering into obligations with one another, making promises to one another. This now explains why Judaism, which is not interested in the predictability of the natural universe the way scientists and philosophers were, but is interested in the human condition, why the concept of promise is absolutely the key concept in Judaism. Except that in Judaism it is a mutual promise. A and B enter into mutual promises towards one another, and that is what Hebrew calls a covenant, a brit. And that is the central theological concept around which biblical Judaism is constructed. There's something very interesting. I don't know if you ever noticed this. I mentioned yesterday that we have two creations in Genesis. We have Genesis 1, or Genesis 1 to 3, and then we have this world destroyed and then begun again in the days of Noah, and the new terms and conditions for the new universe in Genesis 9. Now, we know from Buber, Rosenzweig, Umberto Cassuto, and various other people, that when the Bible wants to signal a theme, it uses a motif word, it uses a word a number of times so that the Bible which is being heard, people hear those chimes, those repetitions, and a key word will usually be used 3 or 5 or 7 times, 7 in particular. And Genesis 1 has one key word that appears 7 times. Anyone know what that word is? God spoke appears 10 times, but Tov, good. Genesis 1 has the word good 7 times. Genesis 9 has one word that appears 7 times. What is that word? Covenant, Brit. So this new world that God begins with Noah is different from the world he began in Genesis 1, which is all about goodness as a property of things, because it turns out that most things are good, but human beings are only iffy on that score. So no longer is it a universe predicated on the natural goodness of the natural universe. This is predicated on covenant, on human beings being able to enter into obligations with God and God into obligations with them so that they give and honor their word. And now we understand those key words in Judaism. Let us take the 3 key words: faith. We already mentioned one, knowledge, da'at, which in Hebrew doesn't mean knowledge in cognitive sense, but in the personal sense of intimacy and empathy. Now let us take the word emunah, faith. Well, I mean, it appears in Aleph Mem Nun. I mean, the abstract now, no, but, well, yeah, it appears as a verb. Emunah, faith, those 3 letters also mean, what else do they mean? They mean a craftsman who is faithful to his materials. They mean a nurse who is faithful to the infant in her or his charge, etc., etc. The word emunah means not, as many people have pointed out, it doesn't mean faith. It means faithfulness. It means loyalty, fidelity, honoring your commitments. The key covenantal institution is marriage. So being emunah is clearly related to marriage. It means not committing adultery, not walking away from your partner when things get tough. It means hanging in there and being true to one another. That is what it is about. That's what God means when he says through Zir, Ve'erastichli be'emunah, I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. I will be faithful to you. Could you please try and be faithful to me? That is what it's all about. And now we come to the word emet, truth. When Jacob says, Katati mikola emet, I am too small, I feel small in the light, God, of all the kindness and truth you have done to me, he doesn't mean God never told him a lie. What he means is God did what he said he was going to do. He honored his promise. He is emet. He is truthful, meaning he honors his promises. He keeps his word. And so now we can see that the words which in the West, which owes its whole cognitive stance to the world of ancient Greece, the words knowledge, truth, and faith are all cognitive words. But in Hebrew, their equivalents, da'at, emunah, and emet, are not cognitive words at all. They are about morality, about relationships, about covenant, about the bonds we form with words. And now we go back to the question with which I began. How can we say that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam may each have their own integrity in the eyes of God if only one of them can be true? And to a believer, only one of them can be true. And to a skeptic, none of them is true, but they can't all be true. Now that makes sense if you think about truth the way the Greeks thought about truth, the way a scientist thinks about truth. It can't both be Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, although you know some Tuesdays that feel as if they are Wednesday and Thursday. We've just come back from a trip to Australia. We were flying from Melbourne in Australia to Los Angeles in California. It's a 14-hour flight. We leave Monday afternoon, we arrive Monday morning, we arrive before we leave, and you think to yourself, this is not Monday morning, this is Tuesday morning, but it turns out to be, it can't be both, and it is actually Monday morning. But now consider the following multiple choice questions. Tick box A or B or C, but only one. And I'm doing this questionnaire for myself. Am I English? Or am I British? Or am I European? Or am I just a human being? Am I a son? Or a husband? Or a father? Or for that matter, a grandfather? Am I Chief Rabbi of the British Commonwealth? Am I Humanitas visiting professor at the University of Oxford? Or am I just somebody trying to make sense of it all? Tick only one box. Well, I'm sorry, that's nonsense, because anyone who can say that doesn't understand the logic of those relationships. I am every one of those things. We all have multiple relationships. Sometimes they conflict. Last night they conflicted. My duties as visiting professor conflicted with my being chief rabbi, because I am host of a rabbinical conference that's happening down in Bournemouth. But you can handle those conflicts. That's okay. That's life. So, can we all be related to God? The answer is yes. Can God be related to all of us? The answer is yes. And we only thought otherwise by using a criterion of truth and knowledge and epistemology that owes everything to Greece and nothing to the world of ancient Israel, from which Abraham came, who is, after all, the common factor in the three Abrahamic monotheisms. If truth is factual, then A and not A can't both be true, but if it is relational, they can. I am a child of my parents, I am a husband to my wife, I am a father to my children and to my grandchildren, I am Saba, and each relationship is different. I wouldn't even think of comparing them, but each of them is a relationship and each is true of me and them. There are bonds between me and each of them. How did the confusion arise? I've tried to explain. Ancient Greece, one culture, Israel, another, and the simple belief that they are translatable into one another. However, as Robert Frost said, poetry is what is lost in translation. And religion is poetry, it is not prose. Now, people didn't realize this, as I say, because the first Christian was a Jew who spoke Aramaic and Hebrew, but the first Christian documents were written in Greek, and the Hebrew Bible itself was read in translation in Greek. And Hebrew into Greek, Greek into Hebrew don't go. So, Greece gave the world, as I say, philosophy and science, the greatest achievements of the human mind. Hebrew Bible gave the world the idea of covenant, the idea of intersubjectivity, the idea that by giving and honoring our word, we can build a world based on fidelity and trust and love and forgiveness. So these are two different things, two different kinds of truth, and thank heavens we have both. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Sachs, for your words. I think there is time for a couple of questions, so I'm happy to open the floor at once. Yes, please.
You spoke at length about the chasm between Greek and Jewish thought.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could comment on the way that Maimonides, one of Judaism's greatest thinkers, was so influenced by Aristotelian philosophy.
Look, Maimonides was, I think, pretty influenced by Aristotelian philosophy, and Aristotelian philosophy was not Platonic philosophy. You remember that famous, is it the Raphael of the Academy in Athens, with Plato pointing up there and Aristotle pointing down there. Aristotle is much more of an empiricist. Maimonides found Aristotle, in fact, most people did, incredibly congenial. You know, Aristotle does not think in terms of this Platonic world of forms, and he actually believes in looking at the world and relationships as they do. And he, you know, I mean, there's that whole prologue in the opening of the Eudaimenean Ethics, where he speaks about, you know, every subject only having the precision it can arrive at relative to... Aristotle makes clear distinctions between different disciplines. You know, physics, metaphysics, ethics, these are rhetoric and so on. Aristotle was, you know, thought in multiple categories. And many of those categories were very congenial to Jewish thought. Some of them very congenial today. You know, Aristotle's psychology is remarkable, and his theory of education and the ethics of education and the education of ethics, very Judaic. You know, so Aristotle was much less theory-laden than Plato. Aristotle and Maimonides did borrow from Plato as well. There's no question that the Guide of the Perplexed, Book 2, Chapter 40, when he's describing the nature of the leader in Jewish thought, comes up with pretty much Plato's philosopher king. And I actually find Aristotle's politics a little bit the way that Karl Popper found Plato's politics, if you've read The Open Society and Its Enemies. Popper thought Plato's republic was a totalitarian state. And I think any state ruled by philosopher kings, like any state ruled by rabbis, is one that I would rather not be part of. So Aristotle was, in a sense, you know, much less culturally specific, whereas, you know, it was Alfred North Whitehead who called Western philosophy a series of footnotes to Plato. Yeah? So I think the Aristotelian stuff works better with Judaism than the Platonic stuff does. That's not to say that Jewish mystics weren't very close to Neoplatonism, and that's why I said that the Zohar does use the visual metaphor. The the Jerusalem Talmud and the Zohar use the phrase tachazi as opposed to tashma, come and see as opposed to come and hear. So if you want the Platonic element in Judaism, you will find it in Jewish mysticism rather than in Aristotle. Okay. Go for it, and then we'll... sorry, do you want at the back to ask your question first, and then we'll come back to you?
Thank you, yes. I very much take your point about this difference between the Hellenic culture and the Jewish culture. At the same time, I'm also struck, I mean, it's almost put this way, it could become simplistic, thinking that somehow the Jews think sort of auditorily and the Greeks think visually. And yet we have, I mean, you mentioned the Shema, but in the Shema itself, it actually talks about the mezuzah, the tzitzit, looking at visual things, the idea that these are visual things that we use in order to keep our minds in a particular focus and not straying to something else. Yeah. So the visual metaphors, the visual symbols are there also within the Jewish culture. So I don't think we can too easily separate the two.
Yeah, I've just engaged in a piece of extreme abstract simplification, what is called ideal type analysis, because, you know, that's the way you make distinctions clear. But yes, there is a visual element in Judaism. There are several visual elements in Judaism, though sometimes they catch you unaware. Yeah? We have the following sentence in Deuteronomy. It's the beginning of Parshat Ra'eh. See, I have set before you life and death, etc., etc. Then immediately it says, the blessing, if you hear, in Shema, and the curse, if you don't hear, right? We have Isaiah chapter 1, Chazon Yeshayahu, the vision of Isaiah, which begins, hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, or whatever, right? So, you know, every time you see something visual in Judaism, very often it gets taken back by the end of the sentence, but there is no doubt that there are visual reminders, and it seems to me that the temple service, the central sanctuary service, was pretty visual. I mean, the garments of the Kohen and so on. So there are complex tensions and subtleties, and the artless Jew. Somebody wrote a book on this, just arguing against this dichotomy. And the dichotomy that I'm using is a pretty standard one. It appears first in Heinrich Graetz and then is a standard. So yes, I should add all the subordinate clauses, but I said I was going to keep it simple. And indeed, over simple, and you are quite right to say so. Yeah.
Thanks. So you contrasted beautifully the Greek worldview with, as it were, the Jewish world ear. But your lecture took the format of, as you mentioned, an ideal type analysis, which is part of the Greek legacy of thinking. So clearly, it's not just a matter of choosing the Jerusalem over Athens, and we're here in Oxford at a Humanitas lectureship, inheriting the Greek worldview as well. So the question is, in light of this distinction between Athens and Jerusalem, how has modernity or post-modernity and the human situation today rendered this relationship that maybe at once upon a time was distinct, but now seems difficult and almost arbitrary to disentangle?
Well, I just published a book on that. It's called The Great Partnership, God, Science and the Search for Meaning, in which I try and do a very even more oversimplified analysis in terms of the bicameral brain, the right and left hemisphere. But that's a long story, and I don't want to bore you with it, and it's available wherever it is, and it'll be... You can get the Kindle edition rather cheaper, and Amazon.com is a good place to buy it. So I do believe that they are both essential to being human. I think that synthesis of of Athens and Jerusalem, fundamental to Western civilization. The easy coexistence of the two, was first challenged in the 17th century by Newtonian physics, this idea of a mechanistic universe that does not have to have a caring God at its center, even though Newton was a profound believer in God. But the death blow was really Darwin. There's no question about that. And what Darwin finally killed, in my humble opinion, was not religion, but Aristotelian physics and biology, because Darwin said, in effect, you can't identify purposes in nature. Nature is not teleological. So that easy coexistence between an Aristotelian science and a Christian natural theology was broken by Darwin, and that's what the new atheists are all picking up on, but they're misidentifying it. And so since the Great Partnership is to argue that we need both religion and science, we need both the Greek and Jewish, Hebraic worldviews, I tried to relate to right and left hemisphere. And I mean, it is a metaphor, but I do argue for it in working through various other things. And a great book on the subject, which was published a year before mine, by somebody from Oxford, Ian McGilchrist, is a book called The Master and His Emissary, which is about the cultural impact of right-brain thinking and left-brain thinking. So it is quite a big subject. And I just, in a very Jewish way, believe first you separate and then you join. So if we can see what makes science science and what makes religion religion, we can then combine them to make stereophonic sound. And, we are no longer thinking that they're all one thing. They're two different things. And we need to see this world in these two different ways, because reality is multidimensional. Human reality is. It is not a flat, two-dimensional surface. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, so please.
I want to come back to science, because almost all the prevailing, and especially the common sense philosophy of science, is almost the TV screen. The scientist goes out there and picks up some facts, and then he gets truth about the world. And in all sorts of ways, philosophically, for a couple of generations now, but I think in practice now, we have been seeing how a scientific endeavor can be futile, can be misconceived, it can be evil, it can be fantasized, it can be corrupt, even though science as a whole is great stuff. And this human idea of science has been very difficult to because there's truth out there. And it strikes me that these insights are this complementary approach to knowledge, not replacing the Greek idea of science, but seeing science as a human and a moral endeavor, which can actually go wrong and betray itself, could be very powerful indeed. Yeah,
that's really what I'm arguing for. In other words, and to put it, I mean, to simplify it to the ultimate, I can't remember whether I mentioned this yesterday, but to simplify a 120,000 word book into 2 sentences, I say science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. And that then allows us to see that these may be distinct enterprises. Now, the religious significance of this, I haven't got time to go into, but that is God in creation and that is God in revelation, and we need both in order to bring redemption, or etc., etc. But it does seem to me, and I've argued for this in a lot of different contexts, in politics as well, that you have to separate the domains, understand the integrity of each, but the limits of each. And disaster happens when one domain attempts to invade and colonize the other. So in the Middle Ages, there were times when religion tried to invade the territory of what rightly belongs to science and say, no, we know better than you what is scientific truth. Today, I think it's the other way around. I think science is invading this territory that rightly belongs to religion. I lose count of the dozens of books I've read, and there's another one coming out on March 29th by Jonathan Haidt from the University of Virginia, called The Righteous Mind. It's a very nice book of social and cultural psychology and what makes us moral. But there's this huge temptation to think that evolutionary biology, which is a fact, can instruct us on moral choices, which are values. And you read this all the time. Now, I happen to think that evolutionary psychology is extremely interesting. I commend Matt Ridley's The Origin of Virtue, or Robert Wright's The Moral Animal, these, or indeed Richard Dawkins' stuff on reciprocal altruism and so on. The other 2 books are actually better, but nonetheless, the miracle is that selfish genes get together and produce selfless people, which just goes to show that we can't reduce morality to genes. So I think if we respect the integrity of each discipline and at the same time realize that bad things happen when one discipline tries to take over another, then we get responsible science, and then we can begin to ask the really big moral questions, whether to do with the environment or to do with human genetic engineering and all the other big moral questions, which we really need scientists and moral voices, and I don't believe that religious voices are the only moral voices there are. There are good and profound secular humanist traditions as well that I believe we have to listen to. And really, I believe the truth lies in the conversation. And thank you for this conversation.
Thank you once again.